The night at the Abbott mansion was supposed to be quiet, the kind of calm evening that often settled over Genoa City after days of tension and family drama, but fate had something far more explosive in store. Diane Jenkins had returned home earlier than expected, her mind already racing with suspicions she had tried desperately to ignore. For days she had sensed something strange about Jack Abbott's behavior. The distant looks, the sudden disappearances, and the way he avoided answering simple questions about where he had been. Diane had convinced herself that she was imagining things, that after everything they had survived together their marriage was strong enough to withstand the usual storms that life in Genoa City brought. Yet as she walked through the dimly lit hallway of the Abbott house that night, a sound stopped her cold. It was a voice she recognized immediately, Jack's, but it wasn't the tone of a casual conversation or a phone call. It was low, intense, and filled with a strange urgency. Confusion quickly turned into dread as Diane followed the sound toward the guest room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly open, and through that narrow gap she saw something that made her entire world collapse in an instant. Jack wasn't alone. Patty Williams was with him. The shocking sight froze Diane in place as the truth became impossible to deny. Jack and Patty had been hiding a secret relationship, and Diane had just walked in on the moment that exposed it all. For several seconds, she couldn't even breathe. Her mind tried to reject what her eyes were seeing, but there was no mistake. The betrayal cut deeper than any argument they had ever had. Diane pushed the door open fully, the sudden movement startling Jack and Patty, who both turned in shock. Jack's expression instantly shifted from surprise to panic as he realized Diane had witnessed everything. Patty, however, reacted differently. There was a strange calm in her eyes, almost as if she had expected this moment to happen eventually. Diane's voice trembled with fury and heartbreak as she demanded an explanation, but Jack struggled to find the right words. Nothing he could say would erase what she had just seen. Patty stepped forward, trying to speak, but Diane's anger quickly turned toward her as well. The tension in the room thickened with every passing second. Years of resentment, jealousy, and unfinished business between these three people erupted all at once. Diane accused Patty of manipulating Jack, of inserting herself into their lives again just to destroy everything they had rebuilt. Patty fired back, insisting that Diane had never truly understood Jack and that their connection was something deeper than Diane would ever comprehend. Jack tried desperately to calm the situation, but the argument only intensified. Voices rose, accusations flew, and emotions spiraled completely out of control. Then something happened that none of them expected. Patty suddenly reached into her bag, pulling out a small handgun that instantly changed the atmosphere in the room from explosive to terrifying. Jack's face went pale as he realized the situation had become dangerously unstable. Diane froze, staring at the weapon in disbelief as Patty's hands trembled. She insisted she didn't want to hurt anyone, but the pain and desperation in her voice suggested that she was no longer thinking clearly. Jack carefully tried to talk her down, reminding her that violence would solve nothing, but Patty's emotions were spinning beyond control. Diane, still burning with rage and humiliation, refused to stay silent. She continued confronting both of them, demanding answers about how long the affair had been going on and whether everything in their marriage had been a lie. Patty's breathing grew heavier as the confrontation escalated. Jack stepped forward slowly, trying to place himself between the two women, hoping to prevent the situation from spiraling even further. But in Genoa City, moments like this rarely end peacefully. Suddenly, the argument reached its breaking point. Diane shouted something that pushed Patty over the edge, and in the chaos that followed, the gun fired. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the Abbott mansion like a thunderclap, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. For a moment, no one moved. The shock of the shot seemed to freeze time itself. Then one of them collapsed. The question that would soon send shockwaves across Genoa City was simple but terrifying: who had been hit by the bullet? Jack's heart pounded as he looked down, trying to process what had just happened. Diane stood frozen, her face drained of color. Patty's expression shifted from rage to horror as she realized the unimaginable line she might have just crossed. The events that followed would soon become the talk of the entire city. News of the shooting would spread quickly, drawing the attention of the Abbott family, the Newmans, and everyone else whose lives were inevitably tangled in the drama surrounding Jack. Emergency sirens would soon cut through the night as the consequences of that single gunshot began unfolding. But in those first seconds after the trigger was pulled, the only thing that mattered was the terrifying uncertainty hanging in the air. Had Diane been struck by the bullet in the middle of her confrontation? Had Jack stepped in at the last second and taken the hit while trying to protect her? Or had the chaos of the moment somehow turned the weapon back toward Patty herself? Each possibility carried its own devastating consequences, and as the truth slowly began to reveal itself, it became clear that the betrayal Diane had uncovered was only the beginning of a far darker chapter. The secret affair between Jack and Patty had ignited a chain reaction of emotions that none of them could control, and the gunshot was the explosive result. As Genoa City prepared to react to the shocking incident, the relationships that had defined the lives of these characters for years would be tested in ways no one could have imagined. Betrayal, jealousy, guilt, and heartbreak had all collided in one disastrous moment, leaving behind a mystery that everyone would soon be desperate to solve. When Diane caught Jack and Patty together, the confrontation that followed led to a gunshot that changed everything, but the truth about who was hit by that bullet would send shockwaves through Genoa City for days to come. In the seconds after the gunshot shattered the tense silence inside the Abbott mansion, time seemed to slow to a haunting crawl. The echo of the blast lingered in the air like a dark omen, and for a moment none of the three people in the room could fully grasp what had just happened. Jack's ears rang as he instinctively looked around, his heart pounding so violently it felt like it might burst through his chest. Diane stood frozen near the doorway, her expression locked somewhere between shock and disbelief, while Patty's hand trembled uncontrollably as the gun slipped slightly in her grip. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the room, and then, almost painfully slowly, someone staggered backward. The movement broke the silence, and panic erupted instantly. Jack rushed forward, his voice shaking as he called out, desperate to see who had been struck by the bullet. The terrifying uncertainty that followed the shot seemed to stretch endlessly. In that moment, none of them knew whether the worst had already happened. Diane's breathing became shallow as she stared at Jack, trying to read his face for clues. Her mind was still struggling to process the betrayal she had just witnessed moments earlier. The emotional pain of seeing her husband in Patty's arms had already felt unbearable, but now the situation had escalated into something far more dangerous and unpredictable. Tears welled in her eyes, but anger still burned fiercely beneath the surface. She wanted answers. She wanted explanations. Yet, suddenly those questions seemed insignificant compared to the terrifying possibility that someone might be seriously hurt. Jack's first instinct was to protect Diane. Despite everything that had just been exposed, despite the chaos of the moment, his protective instincts kicked in immediately. He moved quickly, positioning himself between Diane and Patty, his eyes locked on the weapon still shaking in Patty's hand. His voice was firm but cautious as he tried to calm her down again, urging her to put the gun down before things got any worse. But Patty looked like a woman on the edge of a complete breakdown. Her eyes darted wildly between Jack and Diane as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. She hadn't planned this. She hadn't intended for things to spiral so violently out of control. The confrontation had overwhelmed her emotions, and now the consequences were staring her in the face. Then came the horrifying realization that someone was bleeding. A dark stain began to spread slowly across the fabric of someone's clothing, and the sight sent a wave of panic crashing through the room. Diane gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as the truth became clearer by the second. Jack's expression shifted instantly from shock to alarm as he realized the bullet had indeed struck someone. He dropped to his knees beside the wounded person, pressing his hands against the injury in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. His voice trembled as he shouted for help, even though he knew they were alone in the house at that moment. Patty stood frozen, the gun slipping from her fingers and clattering to the floor. The sound snapped her out of her daze, and she stared in horror at the scene unfolding before her. She had crossed a line that could never be undone. The weight of that realization crashed down on her like a tidal wave. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but the words refused to come out. The woman who had moments earlier been consumed by jealousy and rage now looked utterly shattered by guilt. Meanwhile, Jack was desperately trying to keep the injured person conscious. His hands were already stained with blood as he pressed harder against the wound, his voice pleading for them to stay awake. Diane watched the scene unfold with tears streaming down her face. The emotional storm inside her had reached an overwhelming intensity. Only minutes earlier she had been confronting her husband for betraying her in the most painful way imaginable. Now she was watching a life-or-death crisis unfold right in front of her. As the seconds passed, Diane finally snapped out of her frozen shock and rushed to grab her phone. Her fingers shook violently as she dialed for emergency help, her voice cracking as she tried to explain that someone had been shot. The dispatcher's calm questions felt distant and surreal compared to the chaos inside the mansion. Diane barely remembered what she said during that call. All she knew was that help needed to arrive as quickly as possible. Back inside the room, Jack continued fighting to keep the injured person alive. The fear in his eyes was undeniable. Whatever mistakes he had made, whatever secrets had been exposed that night, none of it mattered compared to the possibility of losing someone forever. His voice softened as he spoke to the wounded figure, urging them to hold on just a little longer. Patty slowly sank into a chair, her entire body trembling as the magnitude of what she had done overwhelmed her. Tears streamed down her face as she repeated the same words over and over again. "I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to." Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but the guilt in her tone was unmistakable. The distant sound of sirens finally cut through the night, growing louder as emergency vehicles raced toward the Abbott mansion. For Jack, those sirens felt like the only thread of hope left in an otherwise terrifying situation. Diane stood near the doorway, staring helplessly as paramedics burst into the house moments later. They quickly assessed the scene, moving with practiced urgency as they worked to stabilize the injured person. Questions filled the air immediately. What had happened? Who fired the gun? Was this an accident or something far worse? But none of those questions had clear answers yet. As the paramedics worked, police officers began arriving as well, their presence adding another layer of tension to the already overwhelming night. One officer carefully picked up the gun from the floor, placing it into an evidence bag, while others began separating the people involved so they could piece together the truth. Jack refused to leave the side of the person who had been shot, even as the paramedics prepared to move them onto a stretcher. Diane stood nearby, her mind spinning as she realized that everything had changed in a matter of minutes. Her marriage, her trust, her entire sense of stability had been shattered in one explosive confrontation. But the mystery still lingered. Who had truly been the victim of that bullet? The answer to that question would soon send shockwaves across Genoa City. News of the shooting would spread rapidly, drawing the attention of family members, friends, and enemies alike. The Abbott family would be thrown into crisis mode, desperate to understand how such a catastrophic situation had unfolded under their own roof. Meanwhile, the police investigation would begin digging into every detail of what had happened that night. Patty's future suddenly looked uncertain and terrifying. The woman who had once been known for her unpredictable behavior now faced the possibility of serious legal consequences. Whether the shooting was ruled an accident or something more intentional, the damage had already been done. And for Diane, the betrayal she had uncovered moments before the gunshot would never be forgotten. Even if everyone survived the night, the emotional scars left behind would take far longer to heal. As the ambulance doors closed and the injured person was rushed toward the hospital, Jack stood frozen in the driveway, watching the flashing lights disappear into the darkness. His entire world had been turned upside down in a matter of minutes. The truth was finally out. His secret with Patty had been exposed. A bullet had been fired. And now someone's life hung in the balance. For the people of Genoa City, the shocking events at the Abbott mansion were only the beginning of a story that would unravel over the coming days. Secrets would be revealed, loyalties would be tested, and the consequences of that single gunshot would ripple through countless lives. Because in Genoa City, betrayal never stays buried for long. And the night Diane caught Jack and Patty together would soon be remembered as one of the most explosive scandals the city had ever seen. The tension outside the Abbott mansion remained thick long after the ambulance carrying the shooting victim disappeared down the dark Genoa City road. Flashing police lights painted the quiet neighborhood in red and blue, turning what had once been a peaceful home into the center of a rapidly growing scandal. Jack stood near the front steps in stunned silence, his hands still stained with blood, his mind replaying the horrifying moment again and again. Every second of the confrontation felt burned into his memory, the door swinging open, Diane's devastated expression, Patty's trembling hands, and then the deafening crack of the gunshot that changed everything. Nothing in Jack's life had prepared him for the chaos that had unfolded within those walls. Inside the house, police officers carefully examined the room where the shooting had taken place. Evidence markers appeared on the floor while investigators photographed every corner of the scene. The fallen gun had already been secured, but its presence continued to cast a heavy shadow over everyone involved. Diane sat on the living room sofa wrapped in a blanket provided by one of the paramedics, her eyes distant and unfocused. The emotional shock of the night had left her completely drained. Betrayal, fear, anger, heartbreak, every emotion was crashing into her at once. The image of Jack and Patty together refused to leave her mind, but now it was tangled with the terrifying memory of the gunshot. A detective approached Diane gently, asking if she felt well enough to answer a few questions. At first she hesitated, her voice barely audible when she spoke. She explained how she had returned home unexpectedly and heard voices coming from the guest room. As she described opening the door and discovering Jack and Patty together, her hands began to shake again. The humiliation of that moment still cut deeply. But when she described the moment Patty pulled the gun from her bag, the room seemed to grow even quieter. Every officer listening knew that what happened next would determine how serious the legal consequences might be. Meanwhile, across the room, Patty sat alone in a chair with an officer standing nearby. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. The shock had not worn off yet, but guilt had already settled heavily on her shoulders. She kept repeating that she never meant for anyone to get hurt, that the gun was only meant to scare Diane into leaving so she could talk to Jack without being attacked and accused. But even as she said the words, they sounded hollow and desperate. The reality was undeniable. A weapon had been drawn, a trigger had been pulled, and someone had been rushed to the hospital fighting for their life. Jack eventually re-entered the house after speaking briefly with the paramedics. The moment he saw Diane sitting on the couch, the weight of everything he had done crashed down on him. The affair with Patty, the lies, the secrecy, it had all exploded in the worst possible way. He wanted to say something to Diane, to explain himself somehow, but there were no words strong enough to repair the damage. The betrayal was already devastating enough, but now it had been followed by violence. Jack knew their relationship might never recover from this night. The detective soon turned his attention to Jack as well, asking him to describe exactly what happened before the gun was fired. Jack spoke slowly, carefully trying to piece together the chaotic sequence of events. He admitted that Diane had caught them together and that the confrontation quickly spiraled into a heated argument. He explained how Patty had become increasingly emotional and unstable before suddenly pulling the gun from her purse. Jack insisted he tried to calm her down and step between the two women, but everything happened so fast that no one had time to react when the gun discharged. As officers continued gathering statements, the hospital became the next focal point of concern. Doctors and nurses worked urgently in the emergency room to stabilize the shooting victim. News of the incident was already spreading across Genoa City through phone calls and whispers. Before long, family members would begin arriving, desperate for answers about what had happened inside the Abbott mansion. Back at the house, Patty's emotional state began to unravel further as the reality of potential criminal charges loomed over her. Her voice cracked as she asked repeatedly whether the victim was going to survive. The officer beside her could only tell her that doctors were doing everything they could. That uncertainty seemed to torture Patty even more. Diane eventually stood up from the couch, steadying herself as she looked across the room at Jack. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken pain. For years they had fought to rebuild trust after countless challenges, but tonight had shattered everything. Diane's voice was quiet but firm when she finally spoke. "You lied to me," she said. Jack lowered his head, unable to deny it. He tried to explain that his relationship with Patty had been complicated and that emotions had gotten out of control, but Diane's expression made it clear that excuses meant nothing anymore. The truth was painfully simple. She had walked into that room and seen her husband betraying her with a woman whose instability had now nearly cost someone their life. Outside, the police investigation continued to grow more serious. Officers began discussing whether Patty would need to be formally taken into custody once her statement was complete. The possibility of arrest hung in the air like a dark cloud. But the biggest questions still remained unanswered. Who exactly had taken the bullet? The answer to that question would determine not only Patty's future, but the emotional fallout for everyone involved. If the victim survived, the night would still be remembered as a horrifying scandal that nearly turned deadly. But if the worst outcome occurred, the consequences would echo through Genoa City for years to come. As dawn slowly approached, the once peaceful Abbott mansion stood as the scene of a tragedy born from betrayal, jealousy, and uncontrollable emotions. The truth about Jack and Patty had finally been exposed in the most explosive way imaginable. Diane's discovery had ignited a confrontation that spiraled far beyond anyone's control. And somewhere in a hospital room across town, the person struck by that bullet was still fighting for their life, while the entire future of everyone involved hung in the balance.